Well, hello, welcome again to another episode of this as yet to be named podcast. I think Michael and Andy are hoping for one particular name to be to come out, but we're still waiting on those piles of letters to come in from our millions of fans to confirm with us what the best name is, what kind of podcast, or Three Men in a Boat. It was, wasn't it? The other one, not Three Men in a Boat.
Podcast.
Three Men in a Podcast, of course. Yeah, Three Men in a Boat. It's always good when you're introducing a podcast, not only to show uncertainty about the name, but even to get the uncertain would-be names wrong. It's just a great. I think if we had to look at the best ways to do a podcast, we've hit the right track, haven't we? Not having a name.
Aaron, you have definitely missed a career in marketing and public relations. I mean, I just think you're a natural.
Exactly, I'm wasting my life there. Yeah, and you've just broken protocol by talking before you've been introduced. But we're just blowing open the whole podcast genre, aren't we? Anyway. I'm Aaron Edwards. In case you didn't hear our first wonderful episode, I'm a lecturer in theology at Cliff College, and we've got Michael Otts, evangelist extraordinaire, who's often in another country, presumably within COVID restrictions, but I'll let him answer whether that is in fact the case or not. And then we've got Andy Bannister, who's also an evangelist extraordinaire and the heads up Solas ministry of. What's the subtitle of Solas, Andy? Are we supposed to be mentioning Solas?
No, you can. I suppose you can. Kind of thing. Yeah. Well, we used to be the Solas Centre for Public Christianity, which is a horrendous mouthful. And then I think as we've refocused in the last few years, especially on evangelism and less away from kind of sort of politics and other kind of things, we thought the Centre for Public Christianity thing was a bit sort of extraneous. So we tend to just be Solas or Solas or however I pronounce it up here. Somebody comes up to me and says, "You English people can't say Gaelic right." Doesn't matter how I know. Somebody tells me that it's wrong, so I say Solas.
Excellent, Solas Consola. And Michael, what's yours called?
My ministry. It's me.
It's Michael Otts.
I guess technically I'm freelance. I'm part of the Association of Evangelists, though, which is a group of itinerant evangelists based around the UK. And I'm also on the European board of IFES. So my main ministry is with students. So in terms of what I actually do, it's supporting Christian unions in the UK and in other parts of Europe.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, often when we end up talking to you, you are on a phone like in Portugal or somewhere else exotic.
Yeah, we did have a lovely conversation. In fact, I'm now feeling kind of jealous of myself and wishing that I was sitting in that sunlit cafe that I was in November when we had that conversation.
I think you may have invented. I remember there was an Eddie Izzard sketch many years ago about an original sin. And you may have invented is self-jealousy an original sin? Self-coveting, something that you yourself have.
I think Eddie comes up with poking badgers with a stick.
That's it, poking badgers with spoons. Yeah,
spoons or something as an original sin. But there we are.
Well, there you go. Yeah.
So anyway, I guess we better talk about something in this podcast that doesn't have a name, but it is supposed to be, loosely based on church Christianity and the culture at large. And today we're going to be speaking about the nature of the relationship between the church and the state. This is similar to what we were speaking about last time when we talked about what is the church. There are many questions that have come up in the last year in everything that 2020 was and everything following from it and all the rest of it. That has brought out this issue in a way that people have had to think about it for the first time. So what kind of authority does the state have over the church, and should the state have over the church? And what kind of role does the church have in challenging the state or saying no to the state, or indeed following the state in what it chooses to say and do? Again, this is something that many Christians haven't had to think about for a while, in the Western context at least, and now are having to for various reasons, which we can get into. So I wonder if, Andy, do you want to kick us off? Seeing as you've got the best radio voice amongst us all, clearly, you've got a kind of specially trained radio voice, I think. So I think if you want to kick us off, just any kind of opening reflections on this issue of church and state.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I mean, I have to say, that's very kind of you to say I've got a perfect radio voice. People might often say that I've got the perfect face for radio. And, but it probably sadly is true.
It's also, you're also really good at name dropping as well, as we know. So I'm just hoping there's going to be a few of those dropped in as well.
Yes, although actually I have to say, as a total random aside, the best name drop I ever came across in my entire life was back in the late 1990s, I ran a small kind of schools work charity down in southeast London, and I had done an assembly at a fairly eminent fee-paying school. And it was a great privilege to go to speak to 1,000 kind of young people. And afterwards, the headmaster gave me coffee in his study. And he was a very nice chap, and he was chatting away. And Colin was a terrible name dropper. And at one point, I think I drank 2 cups of coffee. So I said, "Oh, I couldn't possibly, use the lavatory, could I?" And he went, "Oh, I've got my own one, just en suite. Do use that one." So I went and used it. Came back, and then as I came back into his study, he said, "Do you know the last person to use that lavatory, Andy? That was Tony Blair. Tony Blair last used that lavatory." I thought, that's great. I have my bottom has graced the same porcelain. Prime Minister. So my name dropping is nothing by comparison.
That is superb.
Anyway, let's move rapidly on to more serious things than the bottoms of Prime
Well, hey,
Minister.
that is Tony Blair. That's a person of the state, so it's kind of vaguely related.
Yes, there is a connection. Thank you. Exactly. You'd make a great youth worker, because in youth ministry, I remember the challenge was always, what 2 random things can you connect to make a 5-minute assembly talk? And we've done well there. So churches said, well, let me start by exploring this line and then see what others think. I think for me, one of the troubling things in lockdown has been, obviously, when the pandemic broke and everyone's very terrified. Oh, what's going on? We don't understand COVID. Like, we shut everything down. And the state gets into its head that it needs to close churches down. And I can understand the kind of public health piece and the panic there. But the fact that the churches went along with that so readily, for me, created a rather dangerous precedent. And here in the UK, our law is based on precedent in previous cases. So we have now allowed a case to be created where, whenever the state gets into its head that it's not a good idea for churches to meet, all they have to do is go, "You can't meet." And the churches go, "Oh, yeah, absolutely, absolutely." Whereas I do wonder whether the right response might have been to go, "No, you have absolutely no authority over whether we can or can't." Absolutely, you have authority over some things. I mean, fire regulations, making sure our buildings are in good order, not going to hurt people. That's fine, because even if the state says you've got to close the church while you fix that roof, it's dangerous, we can all go meet in the car park. When the state actually said you cannot meet in any shape or form, I think the church's response, personally, should have been, "Go jump," politely. But we will certainly sit down with you and talk about doing the right thing for our neighbour. And it probably was the right thing to do, to shut down or restrict what we did, but we should have done that voluntarily and out of love for the neighbour, not because the state was telling us this is what you should do. Because, boy, I think if we set a precedent now for the church is now subservient to the state, and I think that is a very dangerous road to go down, and they will come back and bite us on our bottom, even if our bottom has graced the same porcelain.
Indeed. That's right. Yeah, I think that's right. And it's the precedent is the issue, isn't it? There's always the arguments back and forth, love of neighbour, and all these things that are clearly important. But it's the way in which I think people who asked questions of it were seen as not loving their neighbour. It was almost a blanket. It's a Christian thing to obey the authorities, and therefore we must just do it, regardless of whether we may have some questions about it. And there's almost a kind of stigma, wasn't there, about whether you question those decisions, or whether you question the way the government has decided to view the church as not an essential item, as it were. Michael, anything else to add off the back of that?
Yeah,
Tony Blair related or not?
Tony, well, I was just about to name another former British Prime Minister. Actually, I was going to mention Theresa May, because she actually had a very helpful speech in Parliament where she made the point, even if the government is doing this for the most benign motives, I know there are people who kind of see everything as malignant, but actually, even if we assume that they're doing it for the best of possible motives, it sets a precedent that a government in the future with less than honourable motives could then use in a very negative way. I thought that was quite a helpful point, that people are debating, was this the church being deliberately kind of persecuted? Some people saying this is persecution and the governments are against us. And in a sense, it doesn't really matter whether it is or it isn't. The question is that precedent that now it's been set one that can be used, even if it was for good motives, for bad ones in the future? So I think Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's a kind of question of not saying, churches should have just gone kind of all John MacArthur and let's just, not have any restrictions, but actually being told you cannot meet rather than, okay, let's work with you on how we can do this safely. And I think it's interesting actually that, obviously, certainly, sadly not in Scotland, but here in England, even though we're currently in lockdown, churches can meet. And I think partly that was because churches really did make that point quite strongly, and that got through. I think the government in a way that was quite clear. I think another thing that came through was actually, basically, it is such a big thing to basically say to churches you can't meet. I mean, like, it's an affront to religious freedom. You've got to have some pretty strong evidence to kind of do that. And I think what they realised is that we don't have any. Every kind of citing of like why churches were dangerous were like, mass churches in Korea or America or stuff like that. It wasn't, the kind of restrictions that churches had embraced to try and make themselves safe were such that there was no evidence of any outbreaks as a result of church within that kind of, restricted gathering. So I think that was quite significant. And, I'm thankful that obviously that did lead to a change in outcomes, certainly here.
Yeah, that's right. So you jump in, Andy.
Michael said there. Just it was interesting you mentioned, Michael, you mentioned early on persecution. And you were absolutely right. I did get nervous about some Christians sort of suggesting that what we're experiencing kind of here in the UK is persecution. It clearly isn't. I mean, that's just nonsense on stilts, to coin a phrase or borrow someone else's. But the persecution thing, I've been thinking about that for the past few weeks, and I found myself thinking, there is a persecution connection, but we've got it the wrong way around. The way around is right now for a long time in places like, say, China, North Korea and Burma and some of those countries, many Middle Eastern countries, Muslim majority countries, the church is demonstrably persecuted. And the state say, you can't meet. And to go, if we're not careful here in the West, we have lost moral power for speaking into those situations. Because right now, China can say, well, actually, of course we can tell the church not to meet. And you Christians in the West have all agreed the government can do that. We just disagree over the criteria, but we all agreed, right, that the state can tell the church what to do. And then, of course, you could even take it a tad further and go, here in this country, I've talked to Christians who've said, well, we mustn't go to church right now, even if we can, because it's not safe. Well, in China, it's not fricking safe to go to church, because you go to church, particularly if you're in one of the underground churches, not the official ones, you're going to get arrested. And so that's pretty darn unsafe. And so we've ended up in this bizarre position where what authority have we got to be and what sort of grounds have we got to be supporting the work of things like Barnabas Fund or Open Doors and so forth? Because actually, shouldn't we just be saying to churches in China and Burma or whatever, to Christians, they go, no, don't meet, just all meet on Zoom. You don't need to meet in person, just meet on Zoom. They would think we're bonkers. And so I think we've lost huge amounts of authority in how we speak into those situations where people are truly being persecuted, and that really makes me sad.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Andy. I think it links into some of the issues we've seen historically in the history of the church. There have been obviously various manifestations of this issue, and it's really that we haven't had to deal with it as much in recent years in some parts of the West, not all parts by all means, but we've almost gotten soft and used to the fact that we've had certain privileges as the church, and we're used to praying for and sending money everywhere else around the world where the battle is harder for persecution, which certainly it is in relation to state control. But there's also sort of historical precedents that I think lead to this. So we think of the Reformation, for example, and Martin Luther's doctrine of the two kingdoms, where there's a separation between the church's domain and the state's domain. And actually Luther was quite strong on trying to up the power of the state because it was dealing with a situation where the church was all powerful and beyond accountability, able to do loads of horrendous things. And Luther, in challenging the church, wanted to actually emphasize the biblical precedence of the state being a separate domain. But then you fast forward, several centuries later, and you've got Nazi Germany. Lutheranism has taken hold at large in Germany, and all these Lutheran pastors are going, right, well, Luther told us we've got to obey the state and we've got to kind of allow it to do what it's doing because it's one of God's servants, and they just happen to be the Nazis, and they just happen to want to put swastikas up in the church and tell us what we can and can't preach on. And far too many Lutheran churches clearly famously did toe that line, and they believed they were being faithful Lutherans for doing so. So we often transplant a kind of contextual situation, and we treat it as a new kind of law for all time. So that's why you get the situations where no one questions anything, because they think, oh, it's obviously unchristian to challenge anything that the state does. But clearly that's not the case. There's so many examples of it. I mean, I think I was even reading Hebrews 11 with my children recently. We're going through each of the figures in the Old Testament that are mentioned. When it gets to Moses, it talks about Moses' parents hiding him, obviously, because they were not afraid of the king's edict. So they weren't afraid, that they were literally disobeying the authorities. They think, we're going to kill all of the Hebrew babies. Well, no, you're not going to do that. But what if you took a good Christian Romans 13 approach? Said, well, you have to obey the authorities because God told us to. So let's kill Moses. It seems there's things where there's a too simplistic a view, I think, in how we approach these things. Any kind of thoughts about that, about how we often take those precedents and apply them wrongly or perhaps too simplistically?
Well, I've got some, but I spoke a bit before.
Yeah,
Michael, do you want to
go for it, Andy?
Say what I think? I think there's a couple of things I'd say here, Aaron. You're absolutely right. The number of times when I would sort of raise some of these thoughts early in lockdown, before I naively discovered that you end up getting sort of a lot of friendly fire coming your way.
Yeah.
When you do this, I've probably caused myself all kinds of problems on this podcast. But in which case, by the way, I'm not really Andy Bannister. I'm really Michael Lotz's identical twin brother, Derek.
We're going to change the name of Solas. There is no Solas. There never was.
Very seriously, I think a lot of people threw Romans 13, but Romans 13. A couple of things interested me there. Firstly, of course, Romans 13 is not the only thing that Scripture says about about Christians and the state, or God, the people of God and the state. Moses is a great example, but you might think of Daniel, for example. Where the king quite blatantly puts an edict out saying, you must not pray to anybody other than me for 30 days, whatever it was, and to go, I mean, you can't really sort of wriggle around that. And lo and behold, what does Daniel do? He goes into his room and opens by the window and prays towards Jerusalem and blatantly ignores the state. So there's that example. You have the early Christians, who are told by the authorities, stop preaching in this name, stop it, and they go, no, not that. And then, of course, it comes through to Revelation, where the state, where the Roman Empire is portrayed as a sort of demonic beast, according to many interpretations. And so, let's be careful. Again, Scripture offers us a range of models, because there's different ways and different times and seasons with the state is the first thing. And then secondly, even if you just took a narrow band view and took Romans 13, we live in a modern liberal secular democracy here in the UK. And that democracy functions on a number of pillars. It functions on the pillars of citizens actually being involved and making their voices known. That is actually sort of part of our informal constitution. So actually, in one sense, if we don't protest and say, no, we disagree strongly, you are not actually obeying the state. You are actually being a bad citizen.
Yeah.
And also, of course, governments, when it comes to elections, the incumbent government would love you to vote for them. And if you ask Boris Johnson next time the election comes around, he'll be like, I really would rather you vote for me. And to go, but presumably the Christian response is not to go, oh yes, the Prime Minister has asked me to vote for him again, so I shall. I don't know which voice that's supposed to be. I just felt the need to do voices. The right thing to do there would be to say to the Prime Minister, no, go jump. Actually, I'm going to vote for who I want to vote for and who I feel I should vote for, because that's my duty as a citizen. And so protesting and disagreeing and voting against are part of what it means to live out Romans 13 in a country like the UK. Yes, we respect. Yes, we pray for our leaders. Yes, we don't, actively go and break the law or those kind of things. I think there are responsibilities that come with being a good Christian citizen. But certainly, protesting, voting against, making our voices known, not just rolling over and becoming the government's doormat.
Absolutely, and that point was something I made to someone recently. They were basically saying, I'm not sure you should have posted that critical thing about a certain decision that the government have made, as if being critical of the government in any way, shape, or form is going against Romans 13 and being a bad Christian. And actually, as you say, if that was the case, we would never be able to vote against the ruling party. We would always have to just re-elect them into power and live under a dictatorship. So the very fact that we can critique and we can, where appropriate, challenge is part of being a good citizen, part of living out our Christian commitments. But obviously, we want to do that in the right way. It doesn't mean we don't pray for our leaders. Of course, we're commanded to. and we do. But you can both pray for your leaders and think they're profoundly wrong in some of the decisions that they're making at the same time. Like, they're not mutually exclusive things. Like, we're still to pray, but it doesn't mean that we endorse or agree, and we can sometimes protest.
Yeah, that's right. And that picks up on the point that Andy was mentioning earlier about the very preaching of the gospel itself is going to cause trouble at some point. And I think it's really important to not be. I was preaching on this in a sermon last year to say that we don't want to go looking for trouble, but in trying to be salt and light. What does it mean to be salty? We often take the kind of easier, modest, supposedly modest, humble approach when really we're often giving up our proclamation, which the apostles were perfectly happy to get in trouble to do. They were writing their letters from prison, telling you to be good citizens. It should tell you something about the paradox that's involved there. So often we just woodenly read that. You go, so Paul, you're telling me that I must be peaceable, I mustn't cause trouble, mustn't get... Okay, that's because the Christians at that time are being called every name under the sun, being slandered to high heaven. And actually all they've been doing is loving one another, preaching the gospel, seeing people healed, seeing the Spirit move. And that's what's getting them in trouble, because they're proclaiming a Lord who isn't Caesar. And I think we often read that and go, right, okay, we mustn't ever ask questions, as you've both been mentioning, but actually clearly they were happy to cause the right kinds of trouble. They knew what would get them in trouble, and they didn't stop doing it when they knew it would get them in prison. And then when they were in prison, they just used other means of preaching the gospel there too. So we've definitely lost something of the edge in that, and I think you've both been touching on that so far. That is something that's been highlighted more and more in recent sort of times. I wonder if we can just move the discussion onto this issue of what it means to be. You've both mentioned politicians. We've mentioned Tony Blair, of course, and Theresa May. What about this notion of Britain itself as an example of a quintessential Western nation, which has had a huge Christian influence in it? Would you say that Britain is a Christian country? Is it appropriate to use that kind of language? And if it is, how does that affect how the government goes about its business, or how we relate to the government? I mean, obviously, we've had prime ministers in recent years often using Christian language. David Cameron was one of the ones in recent memory who started using the language of Christian nation again, that we are Britain, that's part of Britain's identity. Some people had a big problem with that. He was probably using it for political purposes, as have subsequent prime ministers. But what meaning does it have to say we've got protections as the church here for now, and other places don't, other Christians in other countries don't have this? So what can we make of that whole complex of what it means to have this Christian influence in the seat of government, the heart of government?
I guess if I'm happy to kick off, if you're happy for me to kick off, I should say I'm happy to kick off.
We're happy that you're happy, Michael.
Yeah, we're all happy. Yeah, I think, what was I going to say? Yes, are we a Christian country? In a sense, I want to say yes, and in another sense, I want to say no.
Like a true politician, of course.
Absolutely. I could get a new job. I would probably say no, in as much as, we could almost say we're a post-Christian culture, in terms of what proportion of the British population are active practicing Christians, a much, much smaller proportion than it would have been. So to assuming that basically the general consensus of the British population is Bible-believing Christian, well, not at all. But to flip that round, I also want to say one of the incredible things about what Christianity has done in Britain is it's so shaped our culture, it's so shaped our thinking, our political system, our legal system, and so on over the centuries, that we are far more Christian than we know. So actually, we're profoundly Christian often in our outlook. Think about a lot of the kind of social justice movements and the things that we protest about. We only have those because of the influence of Christianity originally. Those things don't come out of a vacuum. It's just that we don't realize. And I think Tom Holland, in his book Dominion, says one of the profound successes of Christianity is shown in the fact that actually we're more Christian than we know. Like we kind of represent kind of Christian ideas or thinking without even knowing it's Christian. So on the one hand, I'd say no, we're not. On the other hand, I'd say yes, we are. But why are we? And I'd say we are that because obviously the gospel has had a profound impact in the history of this country, in terms of shaping people who've then shaped the nation and shaped the laws and so on. So I guess, particularly as an evangelist, I then think, well, actually, if we want to shape our country, obviously I want to protest when unjust laws are enacted or things are done that I think I disagree with. But ultimately, like as an evangelist, I want to say it's the gospel that has shaped the culture. So if we want to go back to the root, what do we need? We need to see people come to Christ. Rather than just protesting against the symptom, we need to kind of go back to the root cause and say what's going on here, and bring people back to the gospel.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Michael. And actually, just to do Andy's name dropping for him, you mentioned Tom Holland. Didn't Tom Holland do a blurb for your new book, Andy?
He absolutely did, and no blackmail was involved, which was great. We had it in reserve. We did have some things we were going to lean on, but no, he said very nice things about my book, and then I think he also added, "Please don't give Michael Lotz my email address." I think that was.
I was just about to email him about my new book.
That was what he kind of.
I noticed neither of you asked me to do your blurb, but I won't be too offended by that.
I didn't think.
Sorry, you were going to say something there, I think, Aaron, of great wisdom and significance.
Oh, did I cut out? Yeah, I was saying neither of you asked me, I noticed, to do any blurbs, but I won't be too offended.
No. Well, the publisher did say he gave us a list of people we shouldn't, and you were on it. So.
And you obeyed the authorities unquestioningly, like a good.
Absolutely. You know me, I'm not a troublemaker. I always do exactly what I'm told when I'm told. Eventually.
Excellent. So I was just going to say, before. So, what? Anything to add on that, Andy? On that stuff that's come out about Tom Holland?
I mean, I thought Michael covered so much of it. I mean, there's a few things I did think about as he was talking about this. I think you're absolutely right. That distinction about what it means to be a Christian country in terms of practicing, but roots. I think the other thing I find interesting is also many politicians, I think, don't know what Christian means. I think Cameron, didn't really know. And I think in his mind, being a Christian was sort of being a decent kind of person and living a certain decent kind of life. And in fact, early before that, I think Gordon Brown tried to sort of define at one point British values and Christian values, and it was sort of doing the right thing and fair play and this kind of stuff. And like, well, I'm actually not sure those are explicitly Christian values. There's something of the gospel in there. Which reminds me of something important, and I think it feeds into this bigger discussion right now. I think we do sometimes need to be careful as Christians not to get played by politicians.
Yeah.
I think we see it more easily, funnily enough, when we look at American politics. I think I'm in some ways slightly disturbed at times the way that some Christians have been played more obviously by the Republican Party, the view that if you are a Christian, you will vote for us, right?
Yeah.
The Democrats are not immune from doing it. And we tend to look over there as British Christians and go, well, it'll never happen here. But actually, we get very excited when David Cameron says we're a Christian country. And, when the PM throws us a bone in some way, that we kind of then come up perhaps a bit too quick not to ask the critical questions and assume too much. Because I think for me, one of the big questions behind a lot of what we talked about today and what's gone on with the church and the state and the lockdown scenario is I keep coming back to the thought that, we don't have a theology of resistance in this country. That's a big issue for me. That I often say that to the people, when I meet people who say, well, it was the right thing to do to go along with the lockdown kind of closure where we started almost half an hour ago, to which I always like to respond, okay, well, if that's not the point, where does the resistance point come, and how would we know when we hit it? Would it be if Ofsted started wanting to look at our curriculum in Sunday schools? That was proposed not that long ago. Would it come with a hate crime bill that the SNP, that bastion of good governance, are trying to kind of ram through here in Scotland, which would have all kinds of quite terrifying implications, and so it goes on. So but I don't think we've thought about that as Christians. I think we've been a bit sort of sweet-talked into the fact that the state is broadly our friend. We're a Christian country. There's no problem, nothing to see here move along.
Yeah. And
I actually think the evidence of history tells us that things can turn very quickly. We're not being persecuted. I'm not going to say we're being persecuted tomorrow, but we are going to find it harder, I think, particularly around some of the stuff around transgender and hate speech and those kind of things, with people trying to shut certain voices out of the public square. Yeah. And I think now is the time to figure out, where are our lines? Where is the here I stand, I can do no other? And I slightly worry we haven't done that thinking yet in many parts of the church.
Yeah, no, that's really, really helpful reflection. And that kind of links into something Michael was mentioning earlier, really, about the fundamental need, isn't it, of Christians, people becoming Christians, us being able to keep preaching the gospel and to keep that on the front burner, because that's how you're going to change. That's how Christians change the world, by being who they are, by being Christians, not merely by sort of peppering the landscape a little bit with a few more values taken up by politicians in this or that way. Just before we just in closing, I guess another thing you said there that was interesting, which we'll kind of close on, that the US UK thing is interesting too, isn't it? That we do often, you're so right, we look across the Atlantic and we see the kind of caricature polemic situation they have. And of course, they have separation of church and state. We have the conflation of church and state officially, but we have far fewer Christians ratio-wise than America, and religion plays hardly any significant role in policy in this country compared to in the US. And I think Stephen Fry had said in an interesting debate a few years ago, as an atheist, I actually am I'm against the disestablishment of the Church of England because it's good for atheists. It's good for us to have this. We don't want the separation because then religion would get into politics too much. So let's keep it together and keep people thinking they're Christian when they're not, and then it'll keep all this silly religion out of reality and out of our everyday lives, which I thought was an amusing point to make.
It's fascinating you say that, Aaron, because I remember having a conversation with a atheist I was doing a debate actually with an atheist in Norway. And at the time they were having this big debate about whether there should be a separation of church and state in Norway. And actually he was very strong, just like Stephen Fry, saying, no, absolutely not. He says, look around the world, look at where the church is weakest. It's where they are associated with political power. Look at where it's strongest. It's actually, where it's often persecuted. I'm very happy for it to stay that way because it's not going to grow. So I thought it was one of the best arguments was from an atheist friend.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And of course, on that lovely closing note, that also helps our listenership in Norway to grow. We're hoping to kind of grow our Norwegian market, and Andy's book will get translated into Norwegian soon, I hope as well.
The last one has been the atheist didn't exist.
One more thing, Aaron.
Yeah, go for it.
No, just I'm aware we've been chatting for half an hour, but I think it's getting the balance right, or not so much the balance, but not slipping into one of two extremes. I think one of the dangers we've highlighted today is this kind of danger of not having any theology of the state, basically only reading Romans 13 and thinking that we just have to agree with everything the state does and we can never question it.
Yeah.
And I think this has forced us to actually ask questions about that. And that's been really, really helpful, hasn't it? What if the state isn't being benign in its motives? What if the state is overstepping its mark? How do we respond to that? That's really important. I think that's interesting because you get some people, not the same people normally, kind of very different people, who then go to the kind of opposite extreme, which is they read the most kind of malign kind of motives in states. They're very, very fearful. They'll kind of read the worst possible kind of motive behind everything that happens. And they're almost kind of going around the state of panic, as if, Christendom's about to fall and everything's going to go wrong and woe is us. And I'm kind of encouraged as I read church history, because I think, how did the gospel first flourish? It flourished in a place where there was no religious freedom, no political freedom, where there was very severe persecution at times in the Roman Empire. But the gospel flourished and it turned the world upside down and massively influenced the whole Roman Empire. And look around the world today, where is the church growing most rapidly? As we were saying, it's not in the places where we've had links with political power. It's in the opposite. It's in places like Iran. It's in places like Algeria and places like Nepal. So as I look to the future, on the one hand, for my, I'm fearful because I think, I can see that the trajectory is a bad one unless the Lord intervenes. But on the other hand, I'm kind of encouraged because I think, well, the gospel does very well in those kind of environments. And maybe we need that kind of situation for people to start to see what the true Christianity really looks like, as opposed to kind of nominal cultural Christianity. And so then I get kind of encouraged. And I think, Scripture does seem to point towards a future where there is increased persecution and the growth of God's kingdom. And so let's be aware of that. Let's not be blind to those challenges, but also let's just be really excited that the gospel still works and we've still got wonderful opportunities. And so let's not be panicked by that, and let's continue to hold out the gospel whatever happens.
Amen. That's wonderful reflection. I mean, you should consider being an evangelist, Michael.
Maybe I should. Yeah.
Well, that's all we've got time for really today, but I hope that's been helpful to kind of get into some of those issues, kind of raising some of those questions about these key issues and reflecting on how we as the church can be our best self as the church, I guess, in relation to the culture in which we find ourselves in and the pressures that come upon us in our different situations. Hopefully, who knows, next time we'll even have a name for this thing. But until next time, on this podcast, currently still unnamed. See you next time.
Bye.
Next time.